Picture this.
It's January 1347, somewhere in the frozen forests of Eastern Europe. You're a foot soldier in a medieval army, and the temperature has dropped so low that your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. There's no thermostat to adjust, no electric blanket to crawl under, no hot shower waiting at the end of the day. The nearest warm building might be hundreds of miles away, and you're facing months of this bone-crushing cold with nothing but the clothes on your back, whatever gear you can carry, and the hard-won knowledge passed down from soldiers who survived winters just like this one. Most of us today have never experienced true cold, the kind that kills you if you make the wrong choice, where a single mistake in judgment means you don't see spring. But for medieval soldiers, surviving winter wasn't just about enduring discomfort. It was about staying alive when everything around you wanted you dead, and they figured out ways to do it that would surprise you with their ingenuity and effectiveness. These weren't pampered nobles sitting by castle fireplaces. These were ordinary men who learned to turn snow into insulation, transform animal fat into life-saving fuel, and use their own bodies as heating systems for their entire unit. They developed techniques so effective that some are still used by survival experts today. Yet most people have never heard of them. So how did they do it? How did medieval soldiers not just survive but actually function through winters that would send most modern people straight to the hospital? The answer lies in 5 crucial survival strategies that meant the difference between making it to spring or becoming another casualty of the cold. When you think of medieval armor, you probably picture shining metal plate, but the real genius of medieval soldier clothing wasn't the armor, it was what went underneath. These men had figured out something that modern outdoor enthusiasts are just rediscovering. Your clothing isn't just protection, it's a heating system, and every layer has a specific job to do. The foundation of medieval winter survival started with the skin. Unlike today, where we might throw on a cotton t-shirt, medieval soldiers understood that the fabric touching your body could kill you. They learned that certain materials trapped deadly moisture while others wicked it away, and they chose accordingly. Linen undergarments weren't a luxury, they were survival equipment. Linen pulled sweat away from the skin and dried quickly, preventing the moisture buildup that could freeze against your body and cause frostbite from the inside out. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval soldiers didn't just layer randomly. They built their clothing systems like engineers. The second layer was typically wool, and not just any wool. They needed wool that was still slightly oily from the sheep, because those natural oils repelled water and provided insulation even when wet. A wet cotton shirt will kill you in winter, but wet wool will still keep you warm. Medieval soldiers knew this because their lives depended on knowing it. They figured out that air was their friend, but only if they could trap it. Each layer of clothing created pockets of dead air space, and dead air is one of the best insulators in nature. But they also learned that too much air movement would steal their heat, so they had to balance insulation with wind protection. The outer layer, often a thick wool cloak or leather surcoat, served as a windbreak while still allowing moisture to escape. Medieval soldiers also understood something modern people often miss: your extremities will kill you first. They developed specific techniques for keeping hands, feet, and heads warm that went far beyond just adding more layers. For hands, they used a system of liner gloves made of silk or fine wool underneath heavier leather mittens. Mittens, not gloves. They knew that keeping fingers together shared body heat more effectively than separating them. Their foot warmth system was particularly clever. They wrapped their feet in wool cloth, then put on leather boots that were deliberately sized large enough to accommodate the wrapping without cutting off circulation. Tight boots meant frostbite, and frostbite meant you couldn't march, and if you couldn't march, you died. But they also learned to stuff dried grass, moss, or even shredded cloth into their boots for extra insulation, creating a system that could be adjusted based on conditions and activity level. The real genius was in how they managed moisture. Medieval soldiers learned that sweating in winter was often more dangerous than being cold because sweat would freeze and turn your own clothing into a refrigeration system. They developed techniques for managing their body temperature through layer adjustment, removing or adding specific pieces based on activity level, weather conditions, and time of day. They also figured out how to dry wet clothing using body heat. A wet cloak or tunic could be wrapped around the torso under other layers, where body heat would gradually dry it out while still providing some insulation. This technique let them salvage wet gear instead of abandoning it, which could mean the difference between surviving and freezing. But perhaps most importantly, medieval soldiers understood that their clothing system had to be maintainable in field conditions. They carried needles, thread and patches because a rip in the wrong place could be fatal. They knew how to reinforce high-wear areas before they failed, and they understood which repairs were urgent and which could wait until conditions improved. When medieval armies moved through winter landscapes, they couldn't count on finding buildings to sleep in. Instead, they had to create warmth and protection from whatever materials they could find or carry, and they developed shelter techniques that worked in conditions that would challenge modern survival experts. The foundation of medieval winter shelter wasn't walls, it was ground insulation. These soldiers learned that the earth would suck heat from their bodies faster than the air would, so their first priority was always getting off the ground. They gathered whatever organic material they could find: pine needles, dried grass, leaves, moss, even strips of bark. The goal was to create a thick mat that would prevent body heat from conducting directly into the frozen earth. But they didn't stop there. Medieval soldiers understood that insulation works both ways. It keeps heat in and cold out, but only if you use enough of it. They would gather armloads of organic debris, far more than seemed necessary, because they knew that compressed insulation loses effectiveness. A thick layer of loose material would maintain its insulating properties even when they laid on top of it. For walls and overhead protection, medieval soldiers became experts at reading the landscape. They looked for natural windbreaks, rock formations, dense stands of trees, hillsides that blocked the prevailing wind. But when nature didn't provide, they built their own. Using techniques that were passed down through generations of soldiers, they learned to construct effective windbreaks from available materials. One technique involved creating what modern bushcraft experts call a debris hut, but medieval soldiers had refined it far beyond basic survival. They would construct a framework using dead branches or small logs, creating a structure just large enough for 1 or 2 people. Then they would pile organic debris, leaves, pine needles, grass, moss, onto this framework until the walls were several feet thick. The final structure looked more like a haystack than a building, but it could maintain interior temperatures that were 30 or 40 degrees warmer than the outside air. The entrance was crucial. Medieval soldiers learned to build entrances that trapped warm air inside while keeping cold air out. They would create an entrance tunnel that angled downward into the shelter, taking advantage of the fact that warm air rises and cold air sinks. This created a natural thermal barrier that kept the shelter's warm air from flowing out. But individual shelters were just one part of the system. Medieval soldiers understood that group survival often worked better than individual survival, and they developed communal shelter techniques that maximized shared body heat. They would build larger structures designed to house entire units, with carefully planned layouts that distributed body heat efficiently throughout the space. They also figured out how to use fire safely inside these shelters. This wasn't just about building a fire pit, it was about understanding airflow, smoke management, and fire safety in an enclosed space filled with flammable materials. They learned to create ventilation systems that drew smoke out while keeping warm air in, and they developed techniques for maintaining fires that would burn steadily through the night without requiring constant attention. Medieval soldiers also became experts at site selection. They understood that location could be more important than construction. They looked for spots that were protected from wind but not in low areas where cold air would pool. They avoided areas where snow would drift, and they chose locations with access to fuel and water while remaining defensible. When they had to build shelters on frozen ground where gathering organic debris was impossible, they developed alternative techniques. They learned to use snow as an insulating material, but not in the way most people think. Instead of building igloos, they would dig into snowbanks or create walls of packed snow that would provide wind protection while using other techniques for insulation and warmth. They also understood that shelter maintenance was crucial. A small gap in the wrong place could destroy the effectiveness of an entire shelter system. They carried repair materials and knew how to reinforce shelters that were damaged by wind, snow, or simply the wear of multiple people using them night after night. Fire wasn't just comfort for medieval soldiers, it was the difference between life and death. But creating and maintaining fire in brutal winter conditions required knowledge and techniques that went far beyond simply lighting wood with a match. These men had to become fire engineers, understanding everything from fuel selection to heat management to smoke control, because a failed fire could kill an entire unit. Medieval soldiers learned that not all wood burns the same way, and in winter conditions, choosing the wrong fuel could waste precious energy and materials. They became experts at identifying different types of wood even when it was covered in snow or dense hardwoods like oak and maple burned hot and long, perfect for overnight fires that needed to maintain heat for hours without attention. But hardwoods were also harder to ignite, especially when wet or frozen, so they developed a systematic approach to fire building that started with tinder selection. Medieval soldiers carried their own tinder supplies because finding dry, fine material in winter conditions was often impossible. They used charred cloth, dried fungus, birch bark, pine resin, and even specially prepared organic matter that they would gather and process during warmer months. But they didn't just carry these materials. They understood how to prepare and maintain them so they would work reliably even in extreme conditions. The ignition process itself was a skill that required practice and understanding. Using flint and steel, the medieval equivalent of a lighter, they had to create sparks and nurture those sparks into flame under conditions where wind, moisture and cold were all working against them. They learned to build fire in stages, starting with the finest tinder and gradually working up to larger fuel. But they also knew how to create windbreaks and draft systems that would help their fires catch and grow. But the real expertise came in fire management. Medieval soldiers understood that different fire structures served different purposes, and they built their fires accordingly. A cooking fire needed different characteristics than a heating fire, and a signaling fire was different from both. They learned to build fires that would burn efficiently, producing maximum heat with minimum fuel consumption. Because gathering wood in winter conditions was dangerous, exhausting work, they also figured out how to extend the heat from their fires far beyond the immediate vicinity. Using techniques that modern campers rarely know, they would build reflector walls behind their fires using rocks, logs, or even packed snow. These reflectors would bounce heat back toward their sleeping areas, effectively doubling the warming effect of the same fire. They learned to position these reflectors to create warm zones that could keep multiple people comfortable throughout the night. Medieval soldiers also became experts at banking fires, keeping them alive with minimal fuel input during periods when they needed to conserve wood or when constant fire tending wasn't possible. They would cover fires with ash and specially selected materials that would allow slow combustion to continue for hours, then resurrect the flames when needed by adding fresh tinder and fuel. But they didn't stop with just wood fires. Medieval soldiers learned to use any available fuel source, and they developed techniques for burning materials that most people would never consider. Animal fat could be turned into candles or fuel for small heating fires. Dried dung burned hot and clean when wood was scarce. Even bones could be used as fuel under the right conditions. They also understood fire safety in ways that could prevent disaster. A fire that spread to clothing, shelters, or equipment could kill people faster than the cold would. They learned to create fire containment systems, to choose locations that minimized fire danger, and to maintain fires in ways that prevented accidents while still providing maximum heating benefit. Perhaps most importantly, medieval soldiers figured out how to share fire resources efficiently within a group. They understood that one well-maintained fire could serve multiple people more effectively than several small individual fires, but they also knew how to distribute heat fairly and how to manage fire duties so that no one person bore the entire burden of keeping the group's heating system functional. They developed systems for fuel gathering, fire maintenance, and heat distribution that could operate even when individual soldiers were exhausted, sick, or injured. Because they understood that in winter conditions the failure of the fire system meant the death of the entire unit. Medieval soldiers understood something that modern people often forget. In winter conditions, food isn't just nutrition, it's fuel for your internal heating system. The human body burns calories to generate heat, and without enough of the right kinds of calories, even the best clothing and shelter won't keep you alive. These men had to become experts at winter nutrition, understanding how to keep their bodies running when every calorie counted and food supplies were limited. The foundation of medieval winter nutrition was fat, not the lean proteins that modern diets emphasize, but dense, high-calorie fats that could provide sustained energy for heat production. Medieval soldiers learned that their bodies needed different fuel in winter than in summer, and they adjusted their eating accordingly. Animal fat, nuts, seeds, and oils became crucial components of their diet because these foods provided the concentrated energy their bodies needed to maintain core temperature. But they didn't just eat more fat, they learned how to time their eating for maximum warming effect. They discovered that the process of digestion itself generates heat, and they used this knowledge strategically. Eating before sleep could help maintain body temperature through the night, but eating the wrong foods at the wrong time could actually make them colder by diverting blood flow away from extremity. Medieval soldiers also became experts at food preservation techniques that worked in winter conditions. Unlike modern preserved foods that rely on artificial preservatives, they used methods that actually improved the nutritional value of their food while making it last through months of winter campaign. Salted meats, dried fruits, fermented vegetables, and aged cheeses weren't just convenient. They were specifically designed to provide the nutrients and calories needed for winter survival. They figured out how to prepare foods that would provide sustained energy release rather than quick sugar spikes. Porridges made from mixed grains, stews that combined proteins and fats, and thick soups that stayed warm in the body for hours after eating. These weren't random recipes, they were carefully developed fuel systems for the human body. But the real genius came in how they managed limited food supply. Medieval soldiers learned to stretch food resources by combining different ingredients in ways that maximized nutritional value while making supplies last longer. They knew which foods provided essential nutrients that prevented winter diseases like scurvy, and they understood how to maintain health on minimal rations when necessary. They also developed techniques for finding and preparing emergency food sources that most people would never consider edible. Tree bark could be processed into flour during desperate times. Certain roots and plants remained nutritious even when frozen. They learned to identify and prepare foods that could keep them alive when conventional supplies ran out. Medieval soldiers understood the relationship between hydration and body temperature. They knew that dehydration made it harder for the body to maintain heat, but they also learned that drinking the wrong liquids could actually make them cold. They developed techniques for preparing warm drinks that provided calories, warmth, and hydration simultaneously. They figured out how to eat in ways that supported their clothing and shelter systems. Foods that generated internal heat could reduce the burden on external heating systems. Meals that provided sustained energy could allow them to maintain activity levels that kept them warm through movement and work. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to manage hunger and food distribution in ways that kept entire units functioning. They understood that starving soldiers couldn't maintain the physical activity needed for survival, but they also knew that hoarding food could destroy unit cohesion. They developed sharing systems that ensured everyone received adequate nutrition while maintaining group survival. The most sophisticated heating system available to medieval soldiers wasn't external. It was their own bodies. But using the human body as a heating system required understanding and techniques that went far beyond simply staying active. These men learned to manage their internal heat production, circulation, and distribution, with methods that could mean the difference between maintaining fighting effectiveness and becoming a casualty of the cold. Medieval soldiers understood that the human body generates heat through muscle activity, but they learned that different types of activity produced different heating effects. Quick, intense movement could generate immediate warmth but would also cause sweating that could be dangerous in cold conditions. Steady, moderate activity could maintain heat production without moisture buildup. They developed exercise routines that could be performed in confined spaces with limited equipment and without causing dangerous overheating. But they also figured out that heat production was only half the equation. Heat distribution was equally important. They learned techniques for managing blood circulation to keep warmth flowing to extremities where frostbite was most likely to occur. Simple exercises that promoted circulation, massage techniques that could be performed on themselves or others, and positioning methods that encouraged blood flow to hands, feet, and other vulnerable areas. The real breakthrough came in understanding group heat management. Medieval soldiers discovered that multiple bodies could share heat more effectively than individual bodies could generate it. They developed sleeping arrangements, working formations, and shelter configurations that maximized shared body heat while maintaining tactical effectiveness and personal comfort. They learned to create human heating chains, arrangements where the warmest individuals could share heat with those who were coldest, preventing anyone from reaching dangerous hypothermia levels. These weren't just about crowding together. They were sophisticated systems that distributed body heat efficiently while allowing everyone to rest, work, and function effectively. Medieval soldiers also became experts at recognizing and treating the early stages of cold injury before they became life-threatening. They learned to identify the subtle signs that indicated someone was losing the battle against cold. Changes in speech, coordination, decision-making, and behavior that warned of developing hypothermia. But more importantly, they knew how to reverse these conditions, using body heat techniques and warming methods that could be implemented immediately in field conditions. They figured out how to use their own bodies as heating systems for equipment and supplies that needed to stay warm to remain functional. Weapons, medical supplies, and other critical gear could be kept functional by using body heat, but this required understanding how to do it without compromising their own warmth or health. But perhaps most importantly, medieval soldiers learned to manage the psychological aspects of cold survival. They understood that morale and mental state affected physical cold tolerance, and they developed techniques for maintaining group cohesion and individual determination, even under the most brutal conditions. Because they knew that soldiers who gave up mentally would soon give up physically, and in winter conditions, giving up meant death. When medieval soldiers faced winter, they didn't have any of the technology we take for granted today. No synthetic insulation, no waterproof materials, no portable heaters, no instant communication with rescue services. What they had was knowledge, hard-won understanding of how to keep human beings alive and functional when everything in the environment was trying to kill them. These techniques weren't developed in laboratories or classrooms. They were learned through experience, refined through necessity, and passed down through generations of soldiers who understood that their survival depended on mastering these skills completely. Every method, every technique, every trick was tested under the most demanding conditions possible. Actual winter warfare where mistakes meant death. The remarkable thing is how many of these medieval techniques are still considered state-of-the-art by modern survival experts. The layering systems, the shelter construction methods, the fire management techniques, the nutrition strategies, these weren't primitive solutions. They were sophisticated technologies that worked reliably under extreme conditions with minimal resources. But perhaps the most important lesson from medieval winter survival isn't any specific technique. It's the mindset that made all these techniques possible. Medieval soldiers understood that survival wasn't something that happened to them. It was something they actively created through knowledge, preparation, and determination. They took responsibility for staying alive instead of expecting someone else to rescue them. In our modern world of central heating and emergency services, we've lost much of this self-reliance. But the knowledge is still there, waiting for anyone who wants to understand how human beings can thrive under conditions that seem impossible. The next time you flip a switch to warm your house, remember the medieval soldiers who created warmth from nothing but knowledge, determination, and the materials they could find around them. They proved that humans can survive and even prosper under the most brutal conditions, not through superior technology, but through superior understanding of how to work with the natural world instead of against it. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're facing a winter storm or any other challenge that tests your ability to survive and thrive when conditions seem impossible.